Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight, the Bonita Christian Forum at First Presbyterian Church welcomes you to the continuation of its second decade of testimony in Season 11, Night 3, with Dinesh D'Souza.
Good evening, everyone. We're delighted to have a capacity crowd tonight. My name is Doug Pratt. I'm one of the pastors of First Presbyterian Church, and it is my honor to introduce to you our special guest for this evening. He's a man of a searching and versatile intellect. He is a man who can bridge cultures and understands history and scholarship and politics and theology and philosophy over a vast scope of grasping. He is a man who sometimes controversially and always fearlessly speaks what he believes. He is a fresh voice for our times, and I invite you to join with me as we welcome to the Bonita Christian Forum, Mr. Dinesh D'Souza.
Thank you very much. We are living at a very remarkable moment in history, the history of this country, but also the history of the world. I am thrilled to be here to speak about a topic that is at the core of our current crisis, our current challenge. And that is the role of Christianity in America and in the world. I'm an immigrant to the United States. I was born in Mumbai, Bombay, India. And I grew up in a Catholic family, which may seem very odd. India is a Hindu country. In fact, India is about 85% Hindu and then about 12% Muslim. The Christians are a beleaguered and tiny minority. The reason I became a Christian was that my ancestors converted to Catholicism a couple of hundred years ago. I asked my grandfather once, how did that happen? And he replied, the Portuguese Inquisition. Our family is from a small part of India that's called Goa. And Goa was until 1961, the year I was born, a Portuguese colony. So apparently the Portuguese missionaries came in the 16th century. According to my grandfather, they came with a Bible in one hand and a sword in the other. This was the Portuguese Inquisition, and I understand that the combination was extremely persuasive. So as I grew up as a kid, I sort of had this idea that Christianity had somehow been forced upon me, and forced upon my family. But as I began to learn history, this is as a child in schools in India, I realized that was actually not the whole story. That in fact, the Hindus were very eager to fling themselves into the arms of the missionaries, that they were actually very open to the new faith of Christianity. And I thought, well, why is that? And then I realized that it's because of the Hindu caste system. That if you're in the caste system, and if you're at the top, well, you won the lottery. But if you're at the bottom, you're stuck. And the interesting thing about the caste system is that it doesn't allow you to rise for any reason at all. Your status is permanent. And so for the low caste Hindus, when the missionaries came, even though they were very skeptical that when the missionaries talked about universal brotherhood, the Hindus were skeptical, but the very idea that all humans could be brothers, the very idea that there was not a fixed position for you in life, was appealing enough that a lot of Hindus made their way, accepted, in that case, Catholicism, and took Christian names. That's why I have a Portuguese last name. I don't have any Portuguese ancestry, but it reflects this conversion of a couple of hundred years ago. Now, interestingly, we can't become Christians really that way. In other words, even if we receive from our parents Christian education, at some point, we all have to take the faith of our parents and make it our own. And for me, Christianity came in adult life. As I came to America, I came as an exchange student, and then I just never went back. I went to Dartmouth as an undergraduate. I became a political rebel in those days. I caught the Reagan bug and became a young Reaganite. A few years later, I found myself in the Reagan White House. And it was only really in my 30s that I began to think about the things that I had learned as a child, reflect upon them, and I must say I also discovered evangelical Christianity. I saw in evangelical Christianity a kind of seriousness about faith that pervaded everyday life. In India, I was kind of a social Christian. My whole family was. But in adult life, I saw a Christianity that involved a personal relationship with Christ, an ability to have God present in our life all the time. And that was tremendously appealing. I found my own faith growing. And then one day I was watching television, and I happened to see someone I knew, Christopher Hitchens, a prominent writer, political pundit, writer for Vanity Fair, Oxford-educated, sophisticate, debating a pastor from, I think, if I remember, Birmingham, Alabama. And they were debating theology. And as I watched them, I realized that this was really not a debate because the pastor was doing what the pastor does, i.e. quoting the Bible. And Christopher Hitchens rejected the authority of the Bible to speak about anything. He said, I don't believe the Bible. The Bible to me is junk. And so Hitchens was appealing to history and philosophy and science and political punditry and witticisms. And so I realized, what kind of a debate is this? These two people are speaking two totally different languages. They're like ships passing in the night. And around that same time, we began to see a remarkable phenomenon, which is to say, something that's been called the new atheism. Now, this was kind of odd because you've had atheists and skeptics in Western culture for a long time. But what was remarkable about this new thing, and this new thing is still with us, it hasn't stopped, is that this new atheism represented by Hitchens, the Oxford biologist Richard Dawkins, there's now about 30 of these guys. But if you listen to them, their behavior is extremely odd. In other words, I would describe them as missionary atheists. They're actually evangelical atheists. Their evangelicalism is distinguished by two things, and you can recognize it in two ways. One, they want converts. They want to bring other people to their cause, especially young people. They specialize in winning over young people. The other thing is, the reason you know that they're missionary atheists is that if they were just unbelievers, then you would think that they wouldn't bother too much about it. Why write books like The God Delusion? God is not great. If they didn't believe in God, if they thought God was a myth, it would be similar to you or I believing that unicorns are a myth. But you'll notice that we don't go around writing books called Unicorns Are Not Great, The Unicorn Delusion. We don't spend a lot of our time thinking about unicorns. We just kind of let them be. But these guys are just as obsessed about God as any of us in this audience. As I say, they're particularly eager to encourage others to become unbelievers. In fact, once you get to know the atheists and you begin to tangle with them, I've done a whole bunch of debates with a lot of these leading atheists. I've gotten to know most of them personally. You begin to realize that some of them, it's true, have this kind of disbelief or aggressive unbelief, but a lot of the rest, and I would say the majority, aren't really unbelievers at all. I would actually call them wounded theists. And what I mean by that is that it's not that they don't believe in God, they hate God. They actually have a beef with God. And their atheism, if you will, is a form of intellectual and spiritual revenge. I remember a very revealing moment. Often I would do these debates with Hitchens, and we would sit around afterwards and we would talk. And at one point, he made the comment, in fact, he was kind of joking with me, and he made the comment, he said, "You know, Dinesh, I've just gotten back from North Korea." He goes, "You might be happy to know I just met God." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He goes, "You know, his name is Kim Jong-il. He's a tyrant. And like God, he spends all his time telling everybody what to do. No one has any freedom. Everybody has to bow and scrape in front of God." And Hitchens goes, "I thought to myself, this would be terrible to live under Kim Jong-il. There's only one thing more terrible than that, and that would be to live under the Christian God. The only thing worse than living in North Korea is to go to heaven, because in heaven, the tyranny never ends. At least in North Korea, at some point, you die, he dies, and it's over." So this is the kind of language of the new atheism. And I think you can see in Hitchens' remark, again, if you don't believe in heaven, then this life is the only life, let it be. But what Hitchens was getting at is that he does not want to be under the sovereign authority of God. Freedom to him is not only freedom from God, but I would say moral freedom. Freedom from the Ten Commandments. Freedom from God's laws. He doesn't want to be under the supervision of divine authority. Now, here we are, Christians in what is now, for the first time in America, a non-Christian culture. So our position is pretty unique. It's pretty unique because we're living in a society that was actually set up to be a Christian society. And set up to be a Christian society, not in the sense that all the founders were devout believers, many of them were, but set up to be a Christian society in that the basic ingredients of our society, including its political, its economic, its philosophical underpinning, were all based on Christianity. Even the founders who weren't that devout, when pressed, would appeal to Christianity. Jefferson was a Christian, but he was actually a more heterodox Christian than most of the other founders. And yet, when Jefferson was told, "Go into a room and tell us where our rights come from," Jefferson could only think of one source. Not the social compact, not Locke, but our Creator, who are created equal, endowed by inalienable rights. And that word inalienable is really interesting too. Inalienable means you can't give them up. And if you can't give them up, why not? If they're your rights, why can't you give them up? Why can't you sell yourself into slavery if you want? It's your choice. Consenting adults. The reason your rights are inalienable is that at the core, they don't even belong to you. The rights come from God. They are, in a sense, on loan to you. They're yours, but to a certain point, you can't give them up. They're inalienable. Now, when we think about Christianity and America, or even Christianity in the West, remember, America is part of Western civilization. And Western civilization is built on two pillars: Athens and Jerusalem. So Athens refers to classical Greece and Rome, but Jerusalem refers to Judaism and Christianity. And before Christianity came into the West, a lot of the values that we take for granted and have taken for granted for 2,000 years did not exist. So take, for example, today we have a powerful value in our culture. It's not always respected, but no one would deny it is a value, just simply the idea that human life is precious. Now, just a couple of days ago, we had the big pro-life march in Washington, D.C. Big debate in our society about abortion. So at the edges, human life is perhaps not so precious, not so valued in our culture today. But that is the product of modern secularism. Interestingly, that view that human life is not so precious was shared by pre-Christian Greece and Rome. The Spartans would take the sick child. This is not the sick embryo, this is the sick born kid, and deposit it on the hillside only to find it dead in the morning. And that's not the big scandal, by the way. The big scandal is that the most humane and noble thinkers of ancient Greece, Plato, Aristotle, they knew about that, and they were okay with it. To them, it was no big deal. Why? Because the idea that every human life is precious, we would say sacred, that value came into the West because of Christianity. And the reason that's important is that as Christian influence in America weakens, we can reasonably predict that that value will begin to go away. We won't see it go away in one shot. We will begin to see it go away at the edges and then creep toward the middle. So we'd expect to see in our society that initially the unborn and then the very old and the infirm and people who can't take care of themselves, the value of their lives will be diminished. And ultimately, you'll begin to see utilitarian arguments that apply to them, apply to everyone. If it's inconvenient to have an unwanted child, it might be inconvenient to have a born child. It's kind of inconvenient sometimes to have a 6-year-old running around. So if convenience is driving it, now, I spoke about the preciousness of human life. Let's talk for a moment about slavery, because we often hear it said, in fact, the atheists are very big on the idea that Christianity is just as responsible for affirming slavery as it is for opposing slavery. Because after all, in the Civil War, and we get this right from Lincoln, both sides read the same Bible. And that's true. But it's also true that slavery existed in every known culture. Slavery was, in fact, kind of like the family. It was in China, it was in India, it was in ancient Greece, all over Africa. American Indians had slaves long before Columbus got here. And so slavery didn't actually need any defenders. You can read through oceans of literature that no one's defending slavery. Why not? The reason they don't defend slavery is no one's criticizing it. It doesn't need to be defended. So slavery only becomes controversial in the West when Christians begin to challenge it. And Christians begin to challenge it, by the way, not just in the Enlightenment, not just in recent centuries. Slavery had basically disappeared in Europe between the 4th and the 10th century. There were hardly any slaves in all of Europe, whereas slavery, of course, was widespread in ancient Greece and Rome. And then starting in the modern era, the Quakers, the evangelical Christians, they basically asked a very interesting question. If we are created equal in the eyes of God, they said, if God loves us the same, it then follows that no person has the right to rule another without consent. So that's the anti-slavery principle. No man has the right to rule another man without his consent. But what's interesting is that if you think about that for a minute, that is not only the core principle of anti-slavery, it is also the core principle of democracy, because democracy is based on the exact same idea. No person, no man has the right to rule another without consent. And like I say, when America was founded in 1776, with the Constitution in 1789, and by the way, when the first really free election was held in America in 1800, between the Federalists and the Jeffersonians, that principle had never been tried anywhere in the world. It was tried in America for the first time. And it was tried in America for the first time because of the implementation of this idea. Now, this is our history. Our country was forged out of this Christian philosophy, this Christian outlook. And so the atheist of today is in a really odd position, because the atheist today is standing on a Christian mountain. And they're trying to deny the ground on which they stand. Even the principles that the atheists accept, by and large, are derived from the same Christian outlook, because they are based on assumptions that if you remove those assumptions, the atheist point of view will make no sense. Even atheists believe in things like compassion. Compassion. Let's think about this for a minute. We think, well, compassion, well, that's a universal value. Everybody believes in compassion. That's not true. All human beings have sympathy. When I was growing up, I learned a proverb in high school, which may seem a little bit shocking, but it's worth thinking about. The tears of strangers are only water. Water. And you might think this is a very crude, insensitive way to think, but in reality, it's the way most of the world thinks, because most of the world believes that we owe obligations to people who are near us. We owe obligations to our family, and beyond that, perhaps to our neighbors, and beyond that, perhaps to our friends, and maybe for members of a tribe or community, we owe them some obligations. But if some other guy shows up from some other place in some other country, and he's got problems, we wish him well, but those are his problems. The tears of strangers are only water. That's the way most of the world not only thinks, that's the way most of the world acts, even now. If there was a big famine tomorrow in Rwanda or Haiti, we can already predict the reaction. First of all, in the West, there will be a big hubbub. Oh, it's terrible in Haiti. We've got to do something about what's going on over there. Doctors Without Borders, the Red Cross, churches are collecting bags of food. All kinds of vans are moving in and out. Now, there are many other rich countries in the world. The Arab countries have oil money. China's got a lot of money. There's a great wealth in India. All these people will look over their shoulders at what's happening and go back to doing what they were doing before. No big deal. It's as if it never happened. The tears of strangers are only water. Now, what's interesting is that this Western reaction will occur not only among Christians in the West, it'll occur mostly among the Christians, because Christians are the most generous people in America, but even the atheists will respond with compassion. Even the atheists will support Doctors Without Borders. Even the atheists will feel, oh yes, we got to do something. Let's send some aid over there. So what I'm trying to get at is even the atheist is a product of a Christian culture. Even the atheist accepts values that were taught to him or her because of the Christian legacy of this culture, of this civilization. So why is the atheist then, the atheist who presumably doesn't reject these values, what is their beef with Christianity? Why are they trying to steal our children? What's in it for them? And what can we do about it? I'll just say a word about that, because I also want to make this into a conversation. I want to exchange some questions and discussion with Pastor Doug, and I also want to be able to talk to you. So what the atheists do is that they approach our young people in a very cunning way and use the techniques of knowledge to undermine faith. Undermine faith. They'll say things like, in fact, Bart Ehrman, who teaches at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, Typically, in his opening day of class, he teaches class on Christianity. He'll show up at class, and this is in North Carolina, and many of the kids are Bible-believing Christians. And he goes, okay, guys, hands up. How many of you believe the Bible is the Word of God? Most of the hands go up. He says, how many of you believe that God actually wrote a book, the Bible? Most of the hands stay up. He goes, all right, how many of you have read the Bible from the beginning to the end? And most of the hands go down. And he goes, very interesting. I'm not telling you that the Bible is the Word of God. You're telling me that. You're telling me God wrote a book. Only one book. Wouldn't you think that if you're a Christian, you would have bothered to read that book? Evidently, you haven't. What does that tell you? And then he'll go on to say things like, well, you're a Christian, but why are you a Christian? Have you actually conducted an independent investigation in which you compare Christianity to other cultures? No. You're a Christian because your parents are Christian. You're a Christian because you were raised in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Fort Myers, Florida, Dallas, Texas. If you had been raised in Afghanistan, you obviously would be a Muslim. So your Christianity is not a product of reflection, it's a product of accident. So this is the language of modern evangelical atheism. And so we as Christians today, for the first time, are facing this kind of secular attack. And the secular attack also migrates into politics. And so in the past we could say, well, gee, we don't need to defend Christianity. Why? We just have faith. Faith's enough. But faith is not enough. Today, if you send your kid off into the world, you send him off to college, and then he comes right back, and he goes, Dad, Mom, how do you know that Jesus is the Son of God? How do you know that Christianity is true? And so today we live in a world of questions, of having to engage the other side. And part of what apologetics is, apologetics, by the way, the word apologia, doesn't mean apologizing, but it does mean being able to stand up and defend the faith. And that requires knowledge, but it also requires courage. It requires a little of both. In one of my debates against Hitchens said to me, he goes, Dinesh, all religion is an illusion. It's an illusion. It's wish fulfillment. He says life is hard. We have sickness, we have weakness, we have infirmity, we have death. And because we're weak and we can't face up to life as it is, we make up another world. A better world where there's no sickness, where there's no death. It's called wish fulfillment. By the way, Hitchens did not invent that argument. It comes from Sigmund Freud in a book called A Future of an Illusion, i.e. religion, an illusion. And so in a debate, what you have to do is answer that. And so my answer went something like this. I said, well, Christopher, if you're right, if religion is people wishing for a better world, and so they make up this better world, that explains one half of Christianity, but not the other. Because it is true, Christians do believe in heaven, and in heaven there is no death, and in heaven no one gets sick, and so that is a place better than life itself, and so according to you, that's a place that we might have made up. I said, but in Christianity we also have the concept of hell. Now let's think about that one for a moment. Hell is a little bit worse than diabetes. Hell is even a lot worse than death, right? Death is just turn off the computer. Hell is eternal torment. So why would people who are trying to make up a better world come up with that one? Now, this is a lot of what these debates are like, because my debates with the atheists aren't in church. They're typically in a university campus, they're in a very secular environment, and so what you're doing is using the very language of reason that the atheist is using against Christianity to hit the ball back into their court. You don't have to win. You're not actually trying to refute him. In fact, when I think about these debates and I think about what apologetics is trying to accomplish, one time I was engaged in one of these debates and I was looking at the audience and it hit me that what the audience was looking for is not so much who's smarter, who has a better argument. The audience was really looking, and these are young people in their teens or 20s, and they were basically saying, would I rather be like that guy or would I rather be like that guy? Would I rather go to dinner with Hitchens or would I rather hang out with D'Souza? So I realized that you can win the debate intellectually and still lose if you come across as super boring or as a jerk. You're ultimately convincing somebody that this is the way, not just that they should think, but this is the way they should live. This is actually a better way for them to live. Now, in today's culture, we have to realize that these fights don't just occur in church, and they don't just occur in the political arena. I mentioned the university campus. To me, one of the things that Christians, and by extension I would say this is also true in politics, this is true of conservatives, of Republicans, by and large, while we have been focusing on our own lives, on our work, and sometimes on elections, which occur every 2 or 4 years, our political adversaries, this is the secular left, has been focusing on taking over all the major institutions of our culture. Remember, a culture operates through, let's call them megaphones. That's how you get information out. And one of the problems is that radical secularism owns most of the big megaphones in our culture today. What are those megaphones? Number 1, Hollywood. Number 2, Broadway. Number 3, comedians. I'm thinking of Colbert, Jon Stewart, Bill Maher. So they have Colbert, they have Jon Stewart, they have Bill Maher. We have nobody, nobody, and nobody. Not good. A lot of young people get their ideas from these guys. And then we have the universities, and then we have elementary and secondary education. These are huge megaphones. And so, in some senses, even if we have the best ideas, the best information, the true faith, we don't have the ability to broadcast it out into secular culture. We can broadcast it in the church. We can communicate to our own children. But in the culture, our voice is very, very dim. Even take Christian apologetics. There are about 24 Christian apologists who are fairly prominent in America today. Not one of them is in secular society. All of them are in the church. They speak at the pastor's conference, they speak at the youth conference, and they should. But how often do you see a Christian apologist on CNN, on MSNBC, writing an op-ed in the New York Times? In other words, what is the presence of the Christian argument in non-Christian culture? Very, very thin. And so this is why our side is on the defensive. We are losing our kids to their side. We're not winning their kids over to our side. It's kind of a one-sided hemorrhaging of the faith. So, look, when you live in a society where Christian assumptions can be taken for granted, you don't have to do a whole lot. It's kind of like if you live in a house, you don't really need to know the blueprints of the house, right? You just walk in the corridors, you sleep on the couch, you sit at the dining table. It's only when the house begins to shake that you say, oh, I better go to the attic. I better look at those blueprints. I better see what are the foundations in which help me to understand how this thing was put together in the first place. So Christianity now, for the first time, for a lot of people in our culture, is strange. It's something that they don't get. They've heard about it, but they haven't been raised in it, and they don't know why it makes sense. And so it becomes our job to be the instruments. It's God's job to convert them, but it's our job to be the vehicles for getting the knowledge of what Christianity is and what it means to us, how it makes our life better to them. And we can't do that. We should do that individually, yes, but I guess what I'm also saying is, ultimately, it seems to me, if we are Christians in our own enclave, if we don't step out into the powerful institutions of our culture, now you might say, how do we do that? How do we actually have influence in our culture? I'm actually going to save that thought and come back to it in our discussion. But I want to just close by saying that all of us in this room are actually much more influential than we think. And this is true politically. It's also true in terms of our faith. Most of us in life use a tiny portion of our influence. And we do it partly because we're intimidated and we think that the people out there are so powerful that it's not going to really matter. Years ago when I was in college, one of my professors told me the story of the lion tamer and the lion. So here's the lion on a pedestal, and here's the lion tamer, a little guy with a stick. And the lion tamer is twirling his stick, and the lion is obediently doing little tricks in response to the lion tamer. And the professor asked a very interesting question. Who is more powerful, the lion tamer or the lion? Well, the answer is clearly the lion. But then you have a mystery. If the lion is more powerful, why is the lion so obediently and sycophantically responding to the ridiculous machinations of the lion tamer? And the reason is that the lion doesn't know its own power. The lion thinks the lion tamer is more powerful. So that's our position in society. We think that these political leaders, or these people out there, or these powerful people on television, or these powerful people in the universities, they have the final say. But in reality, we live in a special type of society where even now, the power still is with us. One of the few people who know this, by the way, are the terrorists. Small groups of them know that they can create havoc. Even if they don't come from this society, just the fact that they apply concentrated power, they can drive large numbers of people into craziness. So if they can do that, think of what we, just us in this room, could accomplish if we set our minds to it to have influence. We can accomplish a great deal. And so my message is that as Christians, it's time for us to step it up. To step it up in terms of our convictions, our worldview. Our country certainly needs it. In the end of the day, I'm more worried about America than I'm worried about Christianity. Because Christianity happens to be a story where, we kind of know the ending. So even if we take some blows and some losses and we lose some battles, we will ultimately win the war in the end. By the way, there's no guarantee that that's true about America. There's no inevitability of an American future. There's no permanence guaranteed to an American dream. So, as Christians, as Americans, this is a special time where we're called to do more for our faith and for our country. And I think if we do that, Hegel once said that the owl of Minerva flies by night. And then what he means by that is that in history, everything just looks like it's one thing after another. But only with the benefit of hindsight, you begin to see the importance of things that have happened before. The people who were in the Middle Ages didn't know they lived in the Middle Ages. The people in the Renaissance didn't know they were living in the Renaissance. But with the benefit of hindsight, we look back and go, that was a period of great cultural renewal. That was the Great Awakening. So similarly now, we want to live at a time where some future generation will look back and say, when America hung in the balance, when an aggressive radical secularism stepped out as it never had before, that's when a group of Christians decided to step it up. And they made a difference, and that's why things got better. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Dinesh, I'd like to talk to you a little bit before we open it up to our audience. Thank you for giving such a strong affirmation of the theme verse that is behind me on this platform, that we are to always be prepared to give a reason. You've really inspired us. Let's pursue that a little bit more. If a person wanted to become more knowledgeable about their faith and equip themselves to be, you use the word, an apologist or someone who can defend their faith, what would you recommend?
I would recommend, number one, C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity. Good place to start. A small book, but a kind of a gem. Pascal's Pensées, a book written a couple of hundred years ago. Pascal, a great scientist and mathematician, but also a beautiful writer who thinks of things in a very fresh light. I would recommend reading the Bible. This is what happened to me coming to Christianity as an adult. I read the Bible in a way I had never read it before. And I read it with the same childish sense of wonder that one might ask, why is the sky blue? In other words, I read it kind of like, in the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth. And then I said, who's speaking? Who's telling us this? It can't be God, because God is referred to in the third person. It doesn't say in the beginning, I made the heavens and the earth. It says in the beginning, God did. So it's God isn't speaking. God's in the third person, someone else is speaking, but who could it be since no one else was there? Who's talking? So, in other words, you begin to look at Christianity almost the way, think of the early Christians when they were marching outside of the Jewish world that they came out of, and they encounter polytheists and Zoroastrians and Hindus, and those people have totally different worldview. And so you're now communicating to them. When you begin to think like that, it gives you a fresh way to defend your faith. Because you don't have all the ingrained assumptions that otherwise tend to cloud your judgment. You begin to see it the way the other guy sees it. And all persuasion begins that way. I begin where you start.
You mentioned C.S. Lewis, a great apologist of another continent and another century. And one of the books he wrote was The Problem of Pain, trying to understand why there's evil and why there's suffering. I believe you've taken a whack at that in our times with your book, God Forsaken. Would you like to explain to us a little of your thought and perspective on that seemingly really challenging issue?
I think that book, God Forsaken, was a response to this phenomenon of wounded theism. When you begin to realize that people aren't so much disbelieving in God as sort of taking out their anger on God, you then begin to step back and say, okay, how does one address that? And the reason that's important is that whenever you're trying to really win someone over, you often have to realize that what's really bothering them is not what they say. Like my daughter, who's 20, will come to me and she'll say, Dad, I'm upset about this, I'm upset about that. And I realize that even if I address all those points, I haven't actually appeased her because something else is bothering her. And so if the something else bothering you is that you think that God is just a terrible, mean guy because he could have made a better world, but he didn't, right? Mm-hmm. And then you also realize that many of the easy answers that Christians give to that problem don't really work, such as, well, suffering is good for you. Suffering, in other words, makes us a better person. And while we can all think of suffering that does do that, there is also something, one writer wrote a book called Horrendous Evil. Horrendous evil is the kind of evil from which you never recover. Mm-hmm. You know, your kid is in a devastating accident and they lose both their arms and legs. Their life is turned into a shell of what it was. And you're faced with that, and you have to explain it. And it's not easy to just explain it away. So my book, God Forsaken, was an attempt to grapple with that issue and not try to solve it. No one solved it. But try to make the case for why, at the end of the day, we should accept this world as it is and this life as it is, as a gift from God.
Is that book still available?
It is. Oddly enough, it's available in paperback, and the publishers are funny. They're like, God Forsaken is a bit of a negative title. So they said, they retitled it, What's So Great About God? It's the same book, and it addresses the issue of suffering, but as you can see, they've given it what they call a positive spin.
And that book is available in our book center, by the way, and it's a really good way to equip you to wrestle with those deep questions and have some things you can share that will help your understanding. You teased us a few minutes ago by saying that you might also offer us more thoughts on how we can engage as believers in this culture that's very much up for grabs.
Yeah, I think what I was trying to say is that we're in a fight for the culture, and the institutions of the culture are dominated by people who are very hostile to our values. So what do? For a while, the Christian answer was to send Christian speakers, let's say, to the college campus to offer testimonies or to offer arguments, or to start alternative Christian institutions. Thomas Aquinas College, Liberty University.
Right.
So these are little, let's call them islands of hope in a sea of despair, or islands of freedom. But we have to concede that these strategies don't fundamentally change the landscape. And 30 years ago, it would seem to be completely a lost cause. In order to compete with the universities, what are we going to do? Start 300 new universities of the caliber of Yale and Swarthmore and Berkeley? Can't do it. But the good thing is today, you don't have to do it. In fact, today, trying to retake the university, to me, is like trying to retake the rotary phone industry. So the rotary phone industry is dominated by the secular left. And we can think of all kinds of clever ways, but the good thing is we don't have to retake the rotary phone industry, but we do have to invent the academic iPhone. In other words, if you can come up with a new mode of delivering education today using technology that is high quality, low cost, you will put all these universities out of business because their product is relatively low quality and extremely high cost.
Why, then they'll just become pro football teams, won't they?
And the system they've got now, they've got an unbelievable racket because they're able to convince you to take your hard-earned money and subsidize the destruction of your own values. That is quite an accomplishment, and from a distance, we have to admire it, but we also have to work to stop it.
Okay. We may want to come back to more of this topic of living out as a Christian in a hostile environment, but I want to talk a little bit about you. You have a very fertile mind, and I sense that you are always in motion. I'd like you to share with us about your newest book and your next movie.
So I'll say a word about the movie. It's my third movie. I've made two. Some people describe me as the conservative answer to Michael Moore, which is a very ambiguous compliment. I will say that of the top 10 documentary films of all time, he has 5. but he's made 15 movies. I have 2, but I've made 2 movies. So I'm making a big movie for the summer. It's a secret history of Hillary and the Democratic Party. And being the nice guy that I am, I'm thinking of releasing it the week of the Democratic Convention. With regard to the books, I have a book that just came out a month or so ago. Unusual book for me because I've had some adventures with the Obama administration that resulted in me spending 8 months in this community confinement center under the Bureau of Prisons. You know, initially, I must say, a kind of a terrifying experience because there are all kinds of gangs in there. This was not a white-collar facility. Drug smugglers, armed robbers, the whole gamut.
No Club Fed for you, huh?
No.
Okay.
I took my chessboard and, anyway, expecting that. Yeah. No, I mean, all kinds of gangs, and even, this was on the Mexican border, so mostly Hispanic, but even on the Hispanics, I discovered the American Hispanics are called Southsiders. They have their own group. The Mexicans have their groups. So like I say, initially I was very timid. I didn't want to talk to people because I thought if I talk to this guy, that guy was going to want to kill me. So I was very much to myself. I considered but rejected the idea of starting my own gang, the Asian Indian gang, since I would be the sole member and have to occupy all the offices. Anyway, what I was getting at was, remarkably, after about a month, I realized I was in a very interesting place. I was like an anthropologist in a strange land. I decided to talk to people, learn about them, keep notes, and I had a big political insight, you may say, in the penitentiary. I began to see a peculiar resemblance between the intimidation, the scams, the rackets that I saw in there, and things that were going on in a world that was previously familiar to me, the world of politics. There's a story told about Alexander the Great that will cast a little light on this subject. So Alexander the Great, great emperor of Greece, is told that there's a pirate who's out in the ocean, molesting the seas, boarding ships. So Alexander calls for the guy, yanks him up before him, and he goes, "Where do you get this crazy idea of robbing people and boarding their ships and stealing on the ocean?" And the pirate goes, I got it from you. Alexander goes, "What do you mean?" The pirate goes, "Well, I've got one ship, and so when I do it, I'm a pirate. You've got a whole navy, and when you do it, you're called a great emperor." So the pirate was noting a peculiar resemblance between the small criminal over here and the big criminal over there. And that's one of the themes of this book, Stealing America.
Okay. You had the opportunity early in your career to work for the Reagan White House, correct?
Right.
Tell us a little bit about President Reagan in terms of his faith. You've also written a book about him. What was the level of his personal faith?
So I think that Reagan is in a very remarkable American tradition. You see it in Washington and you see it in Lincoln, of seeing America as a providential nation. The whole concept of Reagan's city on a hill, which comes out of a sermon and comes out of the Bible, this notion that mysteriously America is a part of God's plan. And not only is America part of God's plan, but we as Americans have a special destiny to be part of that. And to be aware of that, and to see ourselves as a godly people in the way that the ancient Israelites were called upon to be faithful to God so that God could work his purposes through them. So America as the new Israel was something that was very much part of Reagan in the way that was very much part of Lincoln. And you felt that the great initiatives that Reagan undertook, even the whole, I mean, who goes to the Berlin Wall? and says, Mr. Gorbachev, take down this wall. We're going to leave communism on the ash heap of history. Now, some of my friends who were speechwriters wrote those words for Reagan, but even they did not believe that the Berlin Wall would actually come down. This huge Soviet empire stretching across multiple time zones, occupying numerous countries, 10 countries between 1974 and 1980, would actually collapse. But Reagan did. And I think that moral certainty came out of his faith.
Let's talk for a little bit about what to look for in a potential president. By the way, you're an American citizen, but you're naturalized. Is that right?
Yes, I came as an immigrant.
You're not native born.
I'm not native born.
So you can't run for president.
Not unless you can find my birth certificate at the Kapi'olani Medical Center in Hawaii.
Okay. Well, if you try to run, there's a billionaire in New York who might raise a problem, but that's beside the point. What impact does personal faith or a lack thereof have upon an American president?
This is a difficult question, and the difficulty of it was imposed upon me in thinking about the issue of character. Because I worked under Reagan, and Reagan was succeeded by George H.W. Bush. Now, militarily, George H.W. Bush was a war hero. Reagan was not a war hero. In fact, Reagan made war movies during World War II. So in terms of actual military valor, Bush over Reagan. But I also noticed that if you have a military parade or a group of Marines and Reagan walked out, these guys go wild. They love Reagan. He was their guy. He was their hero. They like Bush, but he didn't inspire in them the same affection, dedication as Reagan did. Now, how is that possible? How could it be that the guy who was not personally so heroic was able to communicate heroic virtues better than the actual hero? It's a paradox of our time that the important thing in America is to be able to communicate these values and evoke them in the people. But there are some people who have deep faith who can't do that. And there are other people who are more whimsical in their faith, maybe less even reliable, but somehow they're able to tap that chord. So in other words, I'm now talking about the difference between private virtue and public leadership. Ideally, you have both. And we've had leaders in our time who've had both. But I've also seen leaders who are short on the one, but surprisingly good on the other.
Okay, thank you. Well, I suspect that we've got some questions in this place. And so what we'd like to do now is to invite you to be a part of our discussion with Dinesh. There are microphones available on both sides of the center, halfway back in the main sanctuary. Those of you who are watching in center point, if you'd like to be a part of this, please get up from your seat and make your way to the sanctuary now. There's also a microphone available in the center of the balcony. Here's the way we're going to do this. I will be calling upon individuals who have gone to the microphones, so you may make your way there now. And we ask you to ask your questions, not statements, please, but questions. And we'll invite Dinesh to respond to them, and then we will get as many done as we can in the time we have. If you have a question, would you please go to a microphone now and be prepared to ask? Dinesh, would you join me as we seek for some questions? We have one, first of all, over here in the left side. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Somebody has to start, I guess. On the way here this evening, I saw a number of coexist bumper stickers. And my question to you as a person of great intellect and knowledge is, where would you say coexist stands with the regard to Islam under Sharia. How does Western civilization coexist with Islam under Sharia?
Question is about coexistence. Can we coexist with Islam? And what about this business about Sharia law? I think the short answer is we can, and the way to coexist with Islam is to be stronger than it. To be stronger than it spiritually, and also to be stronger than it politically and militarily. Within Islam, Sharia law is the application of Islamic law to Muslim populations who fall under Muslim control. In other words, as Islam developed in the 7th century and spread south into Africa, north into Europe, east into Asia, as territories fell under Islam, they imposed Sharia law. But there was no Sharia law anywhere else because people were strong enough to repel the Islamic hordes, push them back. And ultimately, the West was successful in pushing Islam out. And so Islam has been weaker than the West for now at least 200 years, and perhaps more. So if that balance of power changes, then Islam will become more emboldened, and the radical Muslims will become more intolerable. To be honest, I think that the United States and the West are plenty strong enough to defeat Islamic radicalism. Our problem isn't over there, it's over here. So as Christians, if I were to say, look at the world is going to go the Christian way, it's going to go the secular way, or it's going to go the Islamic way. It's not a fork in the road, but a three-way. The world is going to go in one of those three directions as we see it from here. And when that happens, it's always tricky because the radical secularists may decide to partner with the radical Muslims against the Christians. So you always have to recognize that sometimes you are not fighting one opponent, but two. And sometimes you also have to make short-term alliances with one or the other to weaken the other one. So that's not religion, that's politics. But the battlefield between Islam, secularism, and Christianity is also being conducted on the battlefield of politics.
Thank you. Let's go to the balcony. Yes, sir, please.
Good evening. On your recent interview on the Eric Metaxas show, I know at the end of the interview he commented to you how good it was to see your daughter, I believe at Dartmouth, and how encouraging it was to see the strength of her faith. And as a father of 4, my wife and I feel our primary responsibility in raising our children is to instill in them a strength of what they believe, how to live that faith, and how to go out into a secular world and defend their beliefs. So I'm wondering, what is it that you have done, and what do you recommend to parents to achieve those objectives?
The question is what to do about our kids and how do we prepare them. The first thing I'll say on the college front is that if you have a son or daughter who is confident and sturdy in their faith and are not going to be shaken very easily, don't hesitate to send them to a secular college, because far from the college contaminating them, they will infect the college. They will actually be an instrument for change in those institutions. We need to send our people abroad, so to speak. On the other hand, if you have a kid who is fragile in his or her faith, be careful, because if you send them into a secular institution, that faith is going to be, not maybe, but will be battered. And so you will need to reinforce it consistently and constantly. young people, when they go to college, they learn the language of reason. They learn the language of debate. It's sort of academic talk. And so it's important to prepare them for that, because that's the language that their professors will use to challenge their faith. And so with my daughter, I just exposed her to ideas and reasoning and had conversations with her in which we would kind of bat these ideas back and forth so that she was actually prepared for them. When she went to college, she was not surprised by these kinds of arguments. She had already heard them before and was kind of ready for them. And that's how we want our children to be when we send them off into the world. Ready.
Thank you. Right side, please.
You've already, good evening. Sorry. You've already kind of touched on it some. I'm just curious, having recently graduated from college, you've kind of touched on the whole institutional kind of issue, but I'm just curious how you, a little more technically, how you work with the traditional Socratic method in college versus that. To me, I've never been able to figure out how I've been kind of trying to figure out how I use that to defend my faith, because it feels like Jesus in the gospel says, believe like a child without questioning, when the basis of the Socratic method is to ask questions. So I know you kind of covered it, but thanks for any further.
This is a very good question, which is to say that if faith is childlike, if the Bible commends a faith that doesn't ask questions, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe, then how is that compatible with the whole Socratic method, which is the deployment of questioning and skeptical reason? I would argue that the way that those two things are compatible is that it's really good and very effective to use the Socratic weapon against the very people who claim to be Socrates. In other words, this would be an example of what I mean. I was in a recent debate with Michael Shermer, who's the editor of a magazine called Skeptic. And Michael Shermer says, in effect, this. He goes, Dinesh, you Christians are half sane. Half sane. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, in ordinary life you're sane. You're engineers, you're doctors, you follow the laws of reason. But he goes, when it comes to your faith, you begin to utter complete nonsense, and you still pretend to be an intelligent person. So, for example, you believe and you insist that there's another life, there's life after death, there's heaven, there's hell, there's this whole other thing going on over there. Well, Dinesh, have you been to the other side of the curtain? Have you interviewed any dead people? No. So what comes after death, you have absolutely no idea, but you go around acting as if you know. In other words, pure insanity. So that's Socratic attack. The best way to meet it is Socratic defense, which goes like this. Michael, you're actually quite right. My belief that there is life after death is based on faith. Now, do you believe that there's life after death? No, I'm a skeptic. Have you been to the other side of the curtain? Have you interviewed any dead guys? No. So, what information do you have that I don't have? None. So, my belief in that there is life after death and your unbelief that there's life after death are both based on faith. I have a faith-based position and you have a faith-based position. So what's the real difference between us? The real difference between us is not that I know and you don't know. The real difference is I'm at least humble and modest enough to admit that my position is based on faith. You, poor deluded fellow, continue to believe that your position is based on reason, even though you don't have any evidence that I don't have. So,
thank you. Left side, please.
Yes. Yes, in reference to the culture wars, you mentioned several of the megaphones that the secular left has at their disposal without much countervailing force to that. You addressed what could be done on the university side, looking looking forward, Hollywood was the first megaphone that you mentioned. Is there a mechanism for getting word out about movies that we should boycott versus movies that we should see? Because to the extent that the tens of millions of Americans who are in conformance with our viewpoints tonight are aware, they can act and hit Hollywood at least a little bit in its pocketbook, which goes a long way to perhaps having them reshape what they expose to us in ways that are more reflective of our values.
Okay, we're asking him to respond to that. Thank you.
So, I mentioned a little moment ago about making a movie and releasing it in the summer in July. So the movie will open probably in 2,000 theaters all over the country. What happens to that movie in opening weekend is absolutely critical. If the movie does well in opening weekend, it'll be in 3,000 theaters the next week. If it does poorly, it'll go from 2,000 to 1,500 theaters in 1 week. So here's my point. You mentioned boycotting movies. A very small thing that you could do that's super helpful is go to the movie on opening weekend, right? You can say, well, I'd rather watch it on DVD. Well, do that also. But if you go watch it opening weekend, you're essentially multiplying the velocity of that film. Because all of Hollywood is watching that movie and how it does. And its power to explode, to reach independent voters, a lot of that depends on how it does the first weekend. So that's a really small thing to do. You may want to go anyway, and it's $10. So if you can go, take friends, go that time, it's much better than doing it 3 weeks later or buying it on DVD. So that's a small, just a, like inside information of how to actually, if you want to help, that's a great way to help. Do it then. Now, boycotting movies is a weak weapon, because it's really hard to organize huge boycotts. It's much more effective to make movies. My formula for making movies is, well, I go to investors, and I tell them to invest money, which I will then use to make a movie, which will then make money, that will then go back to them so that they can do it again. I call this recycled philanthropy. And it's recycled because it's the same dollar going around the block again and again and again. So that's how I do movies, but I have no illusion that Michael Moore is the big man in Hollywood. He's not. The big man in Hollywood is Steven Spielberg. The most effective way that Hollywood tells stories is not by documentary films, but by romantic comedies and thrillers and horror films and animated films. So Christians need to make those. The most effective films aren't Christian films. They are films that happen to be from a Christian outlook. C.S. Lewis made this point very emphatically. He was thinking about clergy and politics. And he said, the most effective people in politics aren't necessarily cardinals and bishops and pastors, but rather Christian lawyers and Christian lobbyists and Christian doctors and Christian activists in the field. So I think we need the same with movies.
Okay, great. Over here to the right.
Dinesh, I recently saw where you're going to be involved in a debate next week, I believe February 3rd, with the unrepentant Bill Ayers. I kind of doubt this is about religion, but I guess anything's possible. But I'd be very interested in how we could tune into that if we'd like, and what your thoughts are going into it. What's the subject matter of it?
Yes, this is going to be very interesting with Bill Ayers. I'm informed that it's the first debate in which, rather than the audience having to go through the metal detector, the two speakers do. I'm being facetious. Well, I debated Bill Ayers at Dartmouth last year, and the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor is sponsoring this debate. It's on American exceptionalism And I'm arranging to have it broadcast through my website, which is just DineshD'Souza.com. It's on February 3rd. So if you want to watch it, you just go on my website and stay tuned to how you can watch it right there. I think it's going to be broadcast live while it's going on, but I'm not positive. Some people are working to make this happen.
Okay. We have 2 more speakers lined up at the microphone on the left. We will take them, and then we will conclude. Yes, sir.
Thank you. First of all, I'm not sure where you go to the movie, but even down here for seniors, it's probably more than $10. But nevertheless, the question I have, I think many of us, I'm sure thousands of us, feel somewhat helpless, whether it be politically or in making some sort of a change or influence in maintaining our religion in this country and what it was based on. I'd be interested to have your thoughts on how individuals like us can make a difference. We feel frustrated, very much frustrated politically.
Just a question,
yeah,
please.
Just a question. Yeah. Just what do you think we can do as individuals to make a difference?
Think about what is the source of your own influence or power. Sometimes these things are best illustrated with an example. And I want to give you a very concrete one because it's a real illustration of power in action. So in 2014, I published a book called America, which came out right around the time of the 4th of July. And the book was widely distributed around the country, including in the retail giant Costco. But then, Costco decided from the very top to pull all my books from every Costco in the country. Now, this was a very remarkable thing. I don't even know how it happened. The leaders of Costco are Democrats. They give money to Obama. However it happened, Costco made this executive decision to pull my book, and I didn't even know about it. Now, a journalist found out about it and wrote an article on a website called World Net Daily pointing this out. D'Souza's book pulled from every Costco. And a lot of angry readers began to comment. They created what I'm going to call an online mob on World Net Daily, railing about Costco. So now, right now, this is very similar to trying to boycott a Hollywood movie. It's kind of ineffective, and it's on a website, and Costco doesn't really care. But then, someone in this online mob decided, why are we discussing this on World Net Daily? Let's go to the Costco website. A very important decision in the history of social media. So the snowball begins to move to Costco, except now it's not 1,000 people, it's 17,000 people. And they essentially, if you in that time went on the Costco website and you tried to click on grills or jeans or toilet paper, you would see very elegant ladies from Florida and Texas cutting up their Costco card into small pieces or mailing it to the CEO. So what I'm getting at is Costco does half of their worldwide business on that site. 17,000 people is a lot of people, but Costco is one of the most beloved companies in the world. The idea that you or I can influence Costco would seem quixotic, absurd. If you wrote 10 years ago, you'd write them a letter, they'd throw it out. But in today's world of social media, you're a powerful guy because you have 300 friends. And not only that, but they have 300 friends each. So you are in a network where you now have power that you didn't have before. The real question is, how can you use that? Just think of the influence of this audience. Not only this church, this audience right here has a huge amount of power. As I say, most of it unused. Now, there are ways to use it. Small example. I go to California, I go to Texas. In both places, I hear the same story. Dinesh, we're in California, our vote doesn't count because California is going to go for the Democrats. So our votes are useless. Then I go to Texas, and I hear the same thing. Dinesh, Texas is obviously going to go for the Republicans. Our votes are useless. Now, the truth of it is, as stated, that's true. So now we have to think. So again, I'm making this movie, right? It's the most powerful messaging I can make about the election. My point is, You take the Republican Club, let's say, for example, in Modesto, California, or in Dallas, Texas. California and Texas may be decided, but there are going to be a finite number of swing voters, maybe 2 million of them, in a whole bunch of swing states. All the names and addresses of those people are known. We have them. So, if your vote is wasted, it's not wasted in Florida, by the way, but if it was wasted in Texas, you can say, I'm going to get the DVD of Dinesh's movie and send it to 100 undecided voters in Ohio. And that way, first of all, it's going to cost me some money. It's going to cost me, let's just say, $1,000. But I can't think of a better way to deploy that $1,000 than to take a message that you are not going to get from the RNC and put it right in the hands of the guy who's going to decide the election. That's how you convert yourself from a useless citizen, having no influence on the process, to, I would call you, an extremely dangerous American, because you are now applying concentrated force exactly where it's going to make a difference. So think like that. In terms of Christianity, I'm giving political examples because they're out of my recent life, but the same principles apply in terms of influencing the culture for Christ.
We have one final question over here. Yes, ma'am.
Excuse me, I have a little trouble with my voice, so sorry about that. But I have a question, and I'm grateful President Reagan and that he dismantled the Berlin Wall and all the country became free because of him, okay? But people maybe practiced the religion of the choice then, and they became not afraid to go into churches of the church, is what I'm saying. And what I'm saying, that they never been mentioned what country the freedom began, start the movement, because I was born in that country. And I know. Can you tell me that?
I'm sorry, ma'am. I did not detect your question.
Okay. The Berlin Wall was demolished because of President Reagan. We're grateful for that. Okay, I don't know if you understand what I'm saying, because my voice. And all this country became free. They may practice the religion of the choice and go to churches not to be afraid.
In Germany?
Yes, the Germany wall became, the wall collapsed.
Yes.
One was English side, one was Russian side.
Fine.
And
please ask your question.
Yes. And then the people was able to practice, go to church of the choice. And I'm saying, then what country start the movement, the freedom began? What country the freedom began? What country? Because I was born in that country, and I know, okay?
Are you talking about the Protestant Reformation?
No, I was born in Poland, and the shipyard workers in Gdańsk,
Solidarity was the first movement in Eastern Europe.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Do you want to respond to that?
Very briefly, I was speaking when I said that Reagan didn't bring the Berlin Wall down by himself. Reagan was probably the crucial figure in that. Margaret Thatcher played an important role in Britain. Helmut Kohl in Germany. Even Mitterrand in France. Lech Walesa in Poland. Václav Havel in now the Czech Republic. And even Gorbachev at the end played a role. So it took a lot of people for this to happen. But you're right that it all began in Poland, and you're quite right about that. That was the trigger of events that set off these great consequences.
It was the spark that lit the fire. Yes. Okay, thank you very much, and would you please join me as we express our appreciation to Dinesh. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.